Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's MarkMonitor webinar, What You Should Know When Managing a Global Domain Portfolio. I'm Corinne Hutchinson, and I'll be moderating today's event. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items. During today's event, all participants' lines will be muted. This is to ensure that there isn't any background noise or interference. Following today's presentation, we'll be holding a Q&A session. To submit a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A tab located on your WebEx console. We are recording today's webinar, and we will send out a follow-up email to everyone with a link to the recording and presentation slides. So please be on the lookout for those materials. With that, I'd like to introduce Elisa Cooper and Matt Serlin, our speakers for today's session. Elisa is Vice President of Product Marketing for MarkMonitor. With 13 years of direct experience, she is an expert in the field of online brand protection and domain name management. Elisa has worked closely with many Fortune 1000 companies in assisting with domain and brand protection policy development. She has spoken and written extensively on these topics and is the chair of the ICANN Business Constituency. She is also an active member of the .US Stakeholder Council, the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition, and the Online Trust Alliance. Matt is Vice President of Global Client Services at MarkMonitor. Matt also brings 13 years of experience in the domain name industry and brand protection to MarkMonitor. He is responsible for all facets of the company's global customer service and support operations for domain name, brand protection, and anti-piracy services, including client, third-party registry, and registrar relationships. As a recognized authority on domain name issues, Matt regularly advocates on behalf of corporate brand holders at ICANN meetings where he serves on the executive committee of the Registrar Stakeholder Group. He also serves as a senior domain name consultant working with MarkMonitor clients on portfolio consolidation as well as domain name and online brand protection strategy development. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Elisa to get us started.
Thanks, Corinne. So I'd like to go ahead and give you a bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about today when we're focusing on best practices for 2015. I want to start off by talking a little bit about what's going on in the current domain name environment. And I also want to talk about some of the challenges that companies are facing and how companies are actually dealing with those issues. And then we're going to dive into some of our best practices. And these are not the same old things that we've been talking about. This is really a new look at ways to really contain and reduce some costs, specifically by paring back portfolios, trying to make some smart decisions about where and when to register. And then we're also going to talk about how to uncover value within the portfolio and how you can really leverage the names that you have by making sure you're getting the most out of them. And also, for some of you, you might have a little bit of gold in there, meaning there might be some names that have some real value that you might consider even selling. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up talking a little bit about some of the things that you need to do to make sure that you have got the appropriate levels of security and ways to handle new brands when they're being launched from a security perspective. And after that, we'll definitely leave enough time for Q&A. And as Corinne mentioned, please do use the Q&A question box down in the right-hand corner of your screen to ask questions as we're going, and we'll do our very best to get through all of them. All that said, I want to jump in and talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the current domain name landscape. As you can see, these are the top 10 most popular TLDs today. Now, we're currently at about 288 million domain names worldwide. That was as of the last quarter of 2014, and we're currently at about a 6.2% year-over-year growth rate. Now, that actually represents a little bit of a drop or decline in the growth of new registrations. That said, 288 million domains is a lot of domains. Now, looking at this list in particular, you might ask yourself, well, .tk, Tukalo, why are they so high up? Well, the reason for that and the answer to that is a registry that provides registrations for free, unless, of course, you're a brand owner, in which case you have to pay for the registrations. But TK is what do they call one of the free registries, and they are essentially giving away domain names for free, and that is why it has become the most popular ccTLD. You'll look on the list, though, and notice others that are well-known and have long been on the list, ones like DE and CN, UK, and NL. Now, in terms of where new gTLDs fit in this landscape, it's an interesting thing to think about. There are currently 5.6 million new gTLD registrations. Now, in comparison to the overall 288 million, it's a small fraction. But there is obviously a lot of focus on what is going on in there, what is happening with cyber squatting, what are the abuse trends, what are other companies doing. And that's something that we've paid a lot of attention to in terms of what other companies are actually doing. So if you compare where companies are actually registering compared to what the most popular TLDs, new gTLDs are overall, you'll see that there's quite a difference. So for companies, .reviews is by far the most popular for corporations. That's where large companies are doing registrations. And you can see this is rank ordered in terms of the top 20 new gTLDs where companies and brands are actually registering domains. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that when companies were making their plans originally in terms of where they were going to register, they looked down the list of all the TLDs and they selected the ones where there was a nexus between what their brand did and what the TLD was all about, and made decisions about either to register or block in those TLDs where it made sense. But some of the most popular TLDs are things like .xyz, that is by far the most popular new gTLD overall. And certainly that is one where companies probably would have overlooked it because there is no natural nexus between any brand and .xyz. I think it'll be interesting going forward to see, because XYZ is now the most popular TLD, new gTLD, will brands going forward feel compelled to do a registration there? And I think, the other big unknown, XYZ, similar to TK, also had a promotion where they were essentially giving names away for free. It will be interesting to see what the renewal rates for some of these registries are that may have given 1 year away for free, but next year are expecting payment of some sort. But it goes even further. So when I say that companies were looking at, where they were specifically having a nexus, if we look at where the different verticals actually registered. Again, this is a representation of where companies actually registered their brands across the new gTLDs, and it makes a lot of sense. What we really saw was that verticals registered very selectively, and they took a hard look at, again, what those TLDs were about, where they thought there was an opportunity to do blocking as a method of protection, and then they made decisions about where they would actually have to register. Now, very few of our clients are really using these TLDs at all. It was really for defensive purposes for the most part. There are a handful of companies that are starting to use them here and there, but for the most part, the registrations were done defensively. But you can see it makes sense that you would find that pharmaceutical companies were registering in things like .healthcare or .vision or .hiv, financial companies registering in .cash and .finance and .fund. It all makes a lot of sense. But again, I think it'll be interesting to see, as some of the most highly registered new gTLDs are not represented in any of these lists, if going forward companies will feel, pressured or will feel compelled to start registering in the most popular of the new gTLDs as well. Now, new gTLDs are not sort of the only issue that corporate domain name owners are facing, and certainly it was a big one in this past year or so. But there are other issues that we find our clients are still facing. Among them, domain security continues to be top of mind and something that companies are still very focused on. But budgeting and billing, as companies are being asked to do more with less, as budgets are being shrunk, as there is this need to register new gTLD registrations, budgets are getting squeezed and companies are feeling the pressure to make sure that they are making smart decisions and that They are able to, in some cases, go back and build back to the different groups or departments that have requested the registrations. And so that has become, I think, an issue that companies are really kind of facing right now. Along the same lines, companies also are very focused and very interested in finally making a real effort to pare back their portfolios. And I think that, this whole idea of paring back domain portfolios is something that companies have wanted to do for a very long time and have looked at it and talked about it. But I feel like at this point we're really at a point where companies really are actually doing the work and making the tough decisions to say, you know what, I don't need these domains. I'm going to mark them to do not renew. And if somebody else picks them up, this is a set of names that I don't care if somebody else picks up because it's not related to my brand and it's something that we never did, or this is something we picked up through an acquisition that we just don't need. So I think, those are sort of the top areas I think that companies are still facing relative to domain management. And certainly there are a number of other items that are still problematic and of concern, but I'd say those are really sort of the top issues that companies are facing today. And really what we're going to focus on today is going to help talk about and address those issues. So given that, I want to talk about some ways for actually containing and reducing costs. And, I think, again, because of all of the different pressures that companies are facing, from budgets that are being asked to decrease, from this requirement or pressure to do more registrations, the fact that the namespace itself is now larger and there's more space to monitor and police and potentially greater requirements for remediation of issues, this has become an area where companies feel like, okay, how can we get control over this? How can we contain the costs and sort of reduce the flow? So one way that we're starting to think about looking at domain name portfolios is to take the portfolio and understand why those domains were registered and why those brands are registered, and basically to categorize brands supporting those domain names. So every domain name theoretically should be registered in support of a brand or a service or a slogan or a campaign. And to then categorize them into groups to say, these are my core brands and my core domains. These are my key brands and key domains and my important and limited. And then to also make sure that you're aligning your trademark approach to your domain name registration approach. And those things together, I think, can help to really ensure that you've got adequate and accurate coverage. And I'm going to talk to you about what that actually means, like what is a core brand? And if you have a core brand, where should you register that core brand as a domain? And I'm going to do that for key, important, and limited brands as well. Now, obviously, like retiring low-risk, low-value domains, that's kind of a given, but that's kind of a tough thing to do. But I'm going to talk to you about some ways to do that as well. Obviously, implementing your own internal policies will help to ensure that, you do not have groups out there doing registrations on their own or making their own decisions about, where they want to have domains. That's critical, and I know that's a tough thing to do, especially for very large multinational corporations, but ensuring that those policies are enforced is critical in sort of reining all that in. And then also, I think the fact that we've had the opportunity with new GTLDs to utilize blocking, I think that's been a very good thing for a lot of companies. It hasn't worked for everyone, but for most it's been a great thing. And then, to not do all the registrations, but take more of an approach of policing for abuse as opposed to trying to do those registrations, because we all know now registering every variation, every misspelling, every typo squat is not possible and not something that we would recommend by any stretch. But let's get into the weeds a little bit and really get down and talk about how can you think about registering brands in a different way. So let's talk about your core brand. So what is even a core brand? When we talk about a core brand, what does that even mean? Well, the way that you might classify a core brand, this would be a trademark in which there are registrations for it in more than 30 countries. Or another way to think about it, if it's a brand that is suffering from more than 5,000 instances of abuse in .com, that might also be considered a core brand. Now, what do you do with your core brands? Where should you register a core brand? Well, this is what we would say. Certainly, of course, exact match. We would also recommend very popular variations. So if there are sort of misspellings that you know are likely to occur, to also consider those, and any other kind of a typo or variation. Then looking across the top 50 top-level domains, obviously also ensuring that if you've done a trademark registration in a particular country, like you've gone through the effort to do the trademark registration, we would recommend that there must have been a reason to do that and to look at also registering the corresponding ccTLD. And then on top of that, again, a very limited number of new gTLDs. But again, these are your core brands. This is your house mark. This is not the sort of secondary and tertiary brands. This is sort of big brands, very big and very important brands. Now, key brands. Now, you might categorize these by trademarks that are registered in between 15 to 30 different countries. Again, there might be a lot of abuse. Again, we might say exact match and typos where it's very obvious that a typo might occur. We're not recommending doing all sorts of misspellings and adding dub and all of that. There was a time 7 or 8 years ago we would have recommended trying to really protect yourself by doing a lot of defensive registrations. We're at a point now that that really isn't possible. However, when you're talking about doing these kinds of variations and misspellings within .com, which is where we see a bulk of abuse, we do still recommend that. Again, for sort of a key brand, again, this is a very important brand, again, looking at the top 25 TLDs, and then again, making that decision to register domains in countries where you have a corresponding trademark. Now, for important brands, this might be a brand that's specific to a particular country or region of the world. This is where we would recommend paring way back in terms of what you're doing in terms of registration. So here we might recommend doing exact match only in the top 10 TLDs, and then also doing, again, the countries where the trademark has been registered. And this is where you start to get you take a much more critical look at sort of doing less registrations for these kinds of brands that are not core brands. They are not targets necessarily of a lot of abuse and a lot of squatting. And limited brands, again, this would be a brand that is very limited in use. Maybe it's something that's going to be used for just a limited time. It's for a particular campaign that's time limited. Again, we'd ask you to look at sort of exact match only and paring way back to look at the top 5 to 10 TLDs. And again, the idea is, this is not going to work, obviously, for everyone. It gives you sort of a framework to be thinking about how do I want to treat my different categories of brands? And I think this is really kind of a new way of looking at what to do going out into the future. Now, we talked a little bit about retiring low-cost and low-value domains. Now, these would be, low-value domains, these would be domains that were registered for brands or products that have been since discontinued, like sweepstakes or promotions that have expired, for companies or brands that are dissolved and no longer in existence. Anything that basically is not being used, will not be used, there's no value to it, definitely focusing there. But the other area where I really feel that, there's a good opportunity to reduce some costs is looking at the really expensive and highly regulated TLDs that you have in your portfolio, where it's not going to be possible for anyone else to have a registration. And a good example of that is a .travel, which was an expensive domain to register, and you had to prove you were part of the travel industry. Also looking at domains where you've got, there's a ton of typos, or there's, a number of hyphens within the name that are in non.com TLDs. The one thing I will always say is that anytime you're marking a name to do not renew, you do have to ask yourself, how will I feel if somebody else registers this? And if you say, I don't care, that's the perfect name to let go. If you do care, then it's a much more difficult decision. Now, I also mentioned sort of enforcing your existing domain name policies. I think, most companies at this point have a fairly well-documented set of policies and guidelines. The question is, are they being followed, and are employees aware of what the policies are? Do people know what they should and should not be doing? And here we provided just a list of important questions that need to be addressed, and people need to know the answers to these so that they can adhere to the policies. If they're simple, like, what should be registered? Who should be allowed to do it? Who should approve it? What is the actual process? What are the budget limitations? Where do the names point? These are all very important things that companies need to make sure their employees have the right answers to, and that is going to help to sort of ensure that there is some containment of costs. And then finally, I think with the new GTLD program, we've had this ability to take advantage of blocking. And for many, as I mentioned, blocking has really been great. The donuts blocking, the right-side registry blocking, those two groups of registries have allowed brand owners to essentially keep others without trademarks from having a registration, and it really protects you against cyber squatters is what it does, as long as your brands are not deemed to be premium. Now, if you've got a brand that also happens to be a three-letter acronym, or you have a brand that's generic, then the blocking sometimes is not working so great. But if you do have a unique brand and you're not ever deemed to be sort of a premium name, then blocking can be a great value to you because it will drastically reduce the cost that you would otherwise spend on defensive registrations, especially with something like the donuts blocking, which ends up being $3 per year per name, given that they've got close to 200 top-level domains. But the other thing I would say is, because we cannot continue this practice of registering every variation, every misspelling, every typo squat, taking more of a stance of really identifying abuse and then only taking action when it's something that is particularly egregious, as opposed to trying to escalate every single thing that you identify, really focusing on where it makes sense, and always starting off with that C&D and then moving to other policies when you're able to, and then when you're not, looking at other alternatives when it's really critical, like anonymous acquisition. But yeah, I think we have a lot of different options to look at aside from just doing the defensive registrations as a way to protect the brands on the internet. So with that, I actually want to turn it over to my colleague, Matt Serlin. He's going to talk to us about really all the ways that you can uncover value. I mean, we talked about the ways that you can pare back and keep others from having registrations and ways to sort of contain those costs, but there's also that option that you're going to make the best use of the names you have and then also potentially uncover something that might be very valuable. So Matt, can you take us through that?
I can. Thank you, Elisa, and thank you again for everyone joining us today. I just want to follow up real quick on reminding you that Elisa covered a lot of material there. I've got some additional things to cover. We've got that Q&A box there in the bottom right-hand corner. We're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so please, as we're going through, put some questions in there. Between Elisa and I think we've got close to 30 years of domain industry experience. So want to make sure that we get to as many questions as we can today. So, as Elisa mentioned, for the past several years, we've seen these corporate domain name portfolios really get larger and larger, and certainly now with the introduction of new GTLDs, which, has been several years in the coming and over a year now in reality, we've seen it happen even more. And so we've been going through a process with our clients to sort of look at their existing domain name portfolios and try to make some sense of it, try to make some recommendations, and to give them visibility into some of the things that Elisa talked about. Things like, are there domains that you can let go that, you picked up along the way that aren't adding any value? So we're going to talk about some of that stuff today. We're going to start with how we score existing domain name portfolios. And then one of the best practices that I really think you'll hear us preach to our clients is ensuring that domain names resolve, and we'll talk about the importance of that. Elisa touched on recovering highly trafficked infringements. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then I do want to touch on selling unused assets or assets that have some value out in the market. Again, over the past several years, we've seen much more interest in that as well. So want to start with this scoring notion. And again, this came out of conversations that we had with clients that, had these domain name portfolios that bloated up into the, several thousands to tens of thousands and beyond. for a variety of reasons, really. But ultimately, what it came down to was, the corporations are know that the domains have gotten out of control, but really are struggling with, how do I even start this process of reviewing 6,000 domain names? And so what we've done is we've developed this proprietary methodology to essentially assign a numeric value to every domain name in your portfolio. And so we use, over 10 factors, and you can see some of them here, including the brand string, how the string of the TLD does in search results, the length of the actual string itself, and the TLD. And so really the goal here is to give people a starting point. And it's certainly not an exact science. There are other factors that are internal factors, right, that people may have more sensitivity to inside the corporation, but that we necessarily don't have visibility into. But I think, when you're talking about trying to wrap your head around these several thousands of domain names, the first question I hear constantly is, where do I even start? And so what this does is it gives you a way to start to look at the portfolio, to make some decisions about, where you can shed domains, where you might be able to sell domains, where, domains that have high value, you want to make sure that you continue to renew and things like that. So again, one of the best practices that we've talked about, you'll hear us talk about a lot, is ensuring every domain name resolves. And so you can see here, at least half of corporate domain names that are registered actually don't resolve to any content. There's a variety of reasons for that. A lot of domains that are registered are, misspellings, typos. They're for product names that never actually got to market or were old and don't actually serve any purpose now. So you can see some of the recommendations here. You really want to make sure that things like misspellings, typos, generally we would say that you'd forward those to your core site, whether it's your home site or some similar site to that. Product names, you want to make sure that those actually send people to the actual product pages so that they can get information on what those products are. And then a lot of folks, and this is pretty common in the CCTLD and certainly the IDN, the international domain names, where they get registered for a certain geography, but don't actually ever resolve anywhere. And there you either want to point them to either it's the native language pages if you have them, or the country or territory pages. So something like a .asia, for example, could forward to an Asian company overview or an Asian services site, things like that. And then we get a lot of questions about the sort of gripe sites, and certainly in light of things like .sucks and others, what should we do with gripe sites? And again, we would recommend you forward those or send those to sort of static pages, again, whether it's the home page or the contact us page or things like that. And then another important thing here, and something that we continue to counsel clients on, is really important to track the query volumes. And we do this, MarkMonitor, as part of our free web forwarding service, is that you're able to actually see just how many queries some of these domain names are getting, so that you start to understand, the traffic that these names are getting. When you go to look at renewal time and make renewal decisions, that's definitely one of the factors you want to consider. And so why is it so important that we tell people that every domain name resolves? Well, as you can see here, if you don't send the domain somewhere, either the ISP or the browser will direct someone that types that name into the browser. They will actually direct them somewhere. And that somewhere is going to depend on a number of things: what browser you're using, who your ISP is, where you are in the world. And so the point is that you really can't control where those people are going to end up. And the only way to control where they end up is for you to either set those names up on your internal DNS infrastructure, or, as I mentioned earlier, to utilize the free MarkMonitor web forwarding service, so that you can make sure those names actually resolve to content that you have chosen that's appropriate based on the criteria that's important to you, and that you're not leaving that in the hands of some third party that you don't actually have any influence or control over. And so, in order to sort of make that a more visual process to our clients, we actually earlier this year or late last year actually rolled out this ability in the MarkMonitor Portal, and you can see it here, that column with the thumbnails there. So in the MarkMonitor Portal, you'll see a snapshot or a thumbnail for every domain name that you have registered with us. And so we do this so that you can actually see where the names are resolving, and whether it's resolving to a MarkMonitor Parks page or your home page, you just can real easily get a quick view as to where those names are going. And obviously, if they're not resolving at all, you get a 404 error, or you might see something that looks like a search page or something else, that you can see that right inside the MarkMonitor portal. You can go in, you can set up a web forward, you can set up a DNS entry, again, to make sure that you're actually controlling where that traffic goes. So moving on, Elisa touched a little bit about this earlier, but really, what we want to focus on is recovering highly trafficked infringements. So it's not really, especially with the new GTLD landscape, it's not really possible to try to go after and reclaim every infringing domain name out there. There's just too many of them. The landscape is too vast. And so, what we counsel folks on is to focus on those highly trafficked infringements where it's either a close match or an exact match to your name. They're getting a lot of traffic. You're seeing either really egregious activity, or it's a name that is getting a lot of traffic that you want to reclaim. And so it's really a way to identify these high value targets, and so you can prioritize. And you can see here in the MarkMonitor, this is the websites module and the brand protection portal. You can see just how many estimated visitors these sites are getting, things like that. So the message here really is to focus on those high value targets, and just because someone registered what is an infringing name, you really have to take a much more critical look at it, how the name is being used, what kind of traffic it's getting, to make those decisions about where you want to focus your enforcement efforts, certainly in light of new GTLDs as well. So, we talked about scoring the domains, and one of the reasons that we do that is to, show you that you might have some assets in your portfolio that you could consider selling. Certainly things like, your core company name or your core products aren't going to be what you want to look at selling, but things like generic words, acronyms, numbers, product lines that were more generic in nature. And you can see here, there definitely are valuable domain names that are being picked up for, some pretty significant sums of money. All of these are six figures and above. And we've actually worked with a number of clients that, as a result of being able to sell some of these domain names, actually are able to then fund, whether it be new GTLD registrations or renewals of their existing domain name portfolio. And so, there are definitely some hidden gems in a lot of these corporate domain name portfolios that, have been registered for so long, whether through, acquisition or old product launches that aren't actually being used. That you actually can get some benefit from taking a critical look at those, getting those out into the marketplace and selling them, whether it be for six figures or not. There certainly are domains that we have identified in clients' portfolios that have been, $50, $60, $150,000 quality domain names that, as I mentioned, are able to then offset some of that budget impact that we see folks taking a hit on with, trying to keep up with all the new GTLD registrations and things like that. So definitely the secondary market is still a place to look at offloading some of those names. So one of the other items that we wanted to talk about, and it really would not be a MarkMonitor domain best practice webinar if we didn't talk about security and protecting critical assets. And again, part of that sort of scoring methodology allows you to look at the most critical, highly trafficked, highly important domain names that frankly you probably already know about anyway. But we want to bubble those to the top to make sure that you've got all the sort of best practice security things in place. We'll touch on some of those best practices here in a minute. So you can see here, the 10 most important things for security around domain names. That first one that I personally and the team here at MarkMonitor has spent the last 6, 7, 8 years on is working with registry operators to roll out what's known as Registry Lock. And we've done that successfully, not only with .com and a number of the legacy GTLDs, but with a lot of the high-profile and highly trafficked CCTLDs as well. So, we continue to see domain name accounts at more retail-focused registrars get compromised, DNS get updated at the registry, sites go down, sites get redirected, and so Registry Lock is really the highest level of security you can have on a domain name. But it certainly isn't the only thing that we recommend putting in place. Things like two-factor authentication, true two-factor authentication with either a token or an SMS-based system, something that we actually require for access into the MarkMonitor Domain Portal. We also do constant DNS monitoring to make sure that the authoritative DNS at the registry is as it should be. I know a number of clients do internal monitoring of their actual external DNS providers, so that if someone gets into your DNS management portal at your third-party DNS provider, they aren't able to update things like A records and other records like that. Continually, manage and review your secondary users. So when folks leave the company, you're updating that list, making sure you're revoking access, mandatory password updates, and using strong password authentication. And then IP access restrictions is another thing that we recommend and offer, so that you're able to access the MarkMonitor portal only through certain IP range. And then, another thing that's really important is we send out, what we call secure account notifications on every domain name that gets updated. If you're, if you see something that looks out of the ordinary or something that shouldn't have taken place, you definitely want to be reviewing those, making sure that you're actioning those as needed. And then again, for corporations, using a corporate-only, corporate security-focused registrar really is probably the single most important thing. A lot of, frankly, most of the domains that we see that get either hijacked or disrupted in some way, shape, or form, they're happening at more retail-focused registrars, because the consumer or the individual with a blog about whatever their favorite topic is doesn't necessarily have all the sensitivities to the security and stability of a multi-billion-dollar business that a lot of corporations need to be mindful of. Another important thing is consolidating the portfolio. So, ensuring that your, global branches and other business units around the world are kind of all consolidated in one portfolio that's being managed centrally. Whether or not you're giving access to those local folks certainly is something to consider, but it really should be as centralized as it can be. And then one thing that we rolled out is MarkMonitor Domain Intelligence, which actually allows you to leverage the Thomson CompuMark, our sister company, to look at a comparison between existing trademark holdings against your domain name registration. So you can see, if you've got trademarks registered in certain countries but don't have the domain names registered, or vice versa. It's a really great intelligence tool to sort of compare those two pieces of intellectual property. Another tool that a lot of our clients utilize, not only to uncover, infringing domain names or targets to go after from an infringement standpoint, but actually a lot of clients use reverse whois to actually uncover registrations that are done by their colleagues in their company. And so, Elisa touched on earlier, it's important to have internal policies and procedures in place to make sure that those are rolled out to the enterprise. But then the question always is, well, how do I enforce them, and how do I find things that are being registered without my knowledge? And so one good way to do that, and we have a number of clients that do this. So, for example, I could go in and look at, every domain name registered with an @markmonitor.com email address. And so, someone in our London office might have registered a domain locally that didn't go through that process. And so every quarter, a couple times a year, they'll go in, they'll run a report, and then they'll reach out to those folks, because by and large, they're not purposefully doing something bad, but they need a domain name for a marketing campaign or a local event or whatever it may be. And so, they go out to GoDaddy or another retail registrar. But by and large, they'll use they're doing it for work purposes. So they'll use their actual work email address. So it's actually a really good way to sort of police yourselves internally to try to then work with those folks to bring those names, certainly if they're being used for any sort of promotional or production type use at all. You want to make sure that you bring those into the fold with the rest of the domain name portfolio as well. And then, one thing that has been a constant is ensuring that you use a consistent role-based whois. And by role-based whois, we mean things like domain admin, DNS administrator, admin at, domains at company name. Still see a lot of corporations out there that have an individual's email address on it. And when you've got an individual's email address on it, things like renewal notices or password update notices or any number of things that really are critical to review don't get looked at. They either the person isn't with the company anymore, or someone's on vacation, or the email goes into a spam box, whatever the case is. And so when you've got this sort of more generic role-based, and generally we advise folks to have several people internally that are appropriate to the function, on the email distribution list. So you've got multiple sets of eyes looking at that stuff. It, of course, will open you up to receiving an increased amount of spam and offers to buy domains all the time, but it really is important to have that sort of role-based email address on the whois record and to get out of using individual email addresses and contact information. We also get a lot of questions and talk to clients a lot about, how do I do that with local presence? So several CCTLDs out in the world still require local information in country to be provided, whether or not it's an individual's name or a physical address. And what we try to do is try to either, use the same information repeatedly, but we also, and actually a number of clients will use MarkMonitor local presence so that, they don't have to worry about the individual in that office changing roles, leaving the company. They have to go back in and remember that those email addresses were used for a whois record, but then actually go and do updates and perform updates on all those domains, which really is, an administrative hassle. And so, wherever possible, either use someone that's, a long-term employee, long-standing, that's been there for a long time, or again, you can work with us to utilize our local presence information. And that way, you don't really have to worry about that sort of turnover and change of staff. And then one thing that I also think is really important here is when you're rolling out new brands, new products, you're doing mergers and acquisitions, you're rebranding something, we get a lot of questions about, what's the best way to handle this? And so a couple points that I kind of want to talk through here. The first is, use an available whois source that's trusted, that's reliable. We have for years heard speculation and people are afraid to use certain whois utilities because, they'll go and they'll do a whois check and the name will show as available. Then they'll go back, a day or two later to register the name, and lo and behold, it's gone. And so for a number of years, there was this not completely unsubstantiated, but it was kind of an urban legend within the domain name system that, people would sniff the whois searches, and people got really nervous about it. And so we still advise folks, there isn't any kind of hard evidence showing that actually does take place, but just to be on the safe side, use, if you're a MarkMonitor client, you can use us, our whois. We can run, we do global availability reports constantly for clients. And so make sure that you're using, there's a lot of free whois services out there that just for security and sense of stability sense, I would probably steer away from. And then Elisa talked about the notion of, ranking the brands that you have. Again, I would encourage folks to look at what they're going to register and where they're going to register, not only in new GTLDs, and I'll reiterate what I think is important that Elisa said, is making sure that where you're registering in new GTLDs, there's a strong nexus between the brand or the product name or the company name and the TLD itself. You want to make sure that you're focusing your registrations on areas that make sense for that product, that service, or the company. And then obviously for the CCTLDs, working and understanding with folks internally to understand, where this product or service is going to be rolled out from a geographical standpoint, and making sure that you're protecting yourself there as well. And then this one is another important one. And so, when you're registering names, even, if you're a MarkMonitor client, there are, every day what's known as the zone file for all GTLDs is made available. And the zone file essentially is a list of all the domain names that are registered. And so every day people look at, all the domain names that MarkMonitor registers and all the domain names that GoDaddy and others register. Well, the thing about when you're using a corporate registrar, people out in the world know that, every domain registered by MarkMonitor, by other corporate registrars, is only for a corporation, right? There's no individual use here at MarkMonitor. It's all registered for companies. And so they'll look at the domain names that we register every day, and, they know based on looking at who is records, who our more high-profile clients are. And so they'll draw a pretty easy connection to, oh, I saw, these dozen names were registered at MarkMonitor today, and MarkMonitor is also the registrar for this company, and so I'm drawing a connection. Wow, that must be the title of that company's new movie or that company's, latest product that's coming out. And so what we've actually done is built out a network of third-party registrars that we have relationships with, that we go out, and they're not just corporate registrars. They actually register names for the general public. And so it's really a way to sort of put some distance in between MarkMonitor, the corporate registrar, and our clients, such that it doesn't present itself as being obvious that name registered at some large registrar in Europe or in Asia is a MarkMonitor is actually for a MarkMonitor client, and so that actually gives us some flexibility to be able to try to keep things under wraps as much as we can. And then again, be aware of timing. I can't tell you how many times, we have worked with clients as domains were being registered or being attempted to being registered as they're, literally sending out a press release or just after they've sent a press release. We really encourage folks to do registrations, as much as possible in advance of some of that stuff. Because, in this age of, social media, things get out faster than you think they're going to get out, or they get out before you're ready for them to get out. And so trying to cut that off at the pass and secure names, again, to the extent possible, more ahead of time, is definitely something that will save everyone a certain number of headaches. So with that, I see we've just got about 12 or 11 minutes left. Both Elisa, are you back on now?
I am.
Excellent.
I see that we have a number of questions in the queue, and I'll just start off at the top here. The first question is, we regularly register .com, .net, .org, .us, and .info for defensive purposes. Does it make any sense to drop extensions such as .us?
It's a great question. My answer is it all depends on your level of risk tolerance. Certainly things like .us and .info are not the most popular GTLDs, certainly by any stretch. But the one thing that they are is relatively inexpensive, and they're available at a lot of the large retail registrars. So, I can very easily see a scenario where you go out and register, a .com and a .org, but you choose not to register the .info and the .us. If someone thinks it's a valuable enough name, there's a pretty good likelihood that someone's going to go out and register that domain and either try to sell it back to you or potentially do something troublesome with it. And so, again, I think it's all about that level of risk. How comfortable are you with the risk that someone's going to go out and register a $10, $15 domain name and what they're going to do with it? So it's not a simple yes or no answer. I think it all comes down to sort of your internal risk tolerance. Elisa, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
I would say exactly the same thing. I think also, if you are a MarkMonitor client, let us do the scoring analysis. Understanding how much traffic that domain is getting, understanding whether or not it's containing your mark, other factors will help to also put it into perspective against the rest of the portfolio to see if that's the best place. I think it's hard to say generically you should always, with some exceptions, again, those high cost, highly restricted, sometimes we can say, without hesitation, yes, let those ones go. But something like .us, I think you have to look at it a little more critically, but I think it's probably, you're looking in the right place, I would say. So the next question is, MarkMonitor offers premium locks for many countries. What's the difference between security for locked domains versus a premium lock? So locking is a word that has many different meanings depending on what you're talking about. A domain can be locked, and what that means is the domain itself is not, depending on what kind of a lock you have on it. If you have, if transfers are prohibited, that is a lock on the name. That's something that is stored at the registry. Now, there's other kinds of locks that we talk about. Sometimes we talk about registrar locking, and sometimes we talk about registry locking. At MarkMonitor, when we talk about registrar locking, we're talking about locking the domain down within the portal, and meaning that you're not able to edit that domain through the MarkMonitor portal. There's a higher level of locking that we offer, which is registry locking. And the difference between that and the other two types of locks is that in order to update a domain that is locked at the registry, a series of protocols must be completed not only with MarkMonitor, but the protocol must also be completed with the registry. And unless those protocols are completed, the names are completely unavailable for editing in any kind of automated fashion. So it's completely impossible to send an update to change name servers or any of the information associated to the domain. And so that is the highest level of locking. When a domain is at that level of locking, the registry locking, it's really impervious to attack for the most part. It's by far the highest level of security that you can employ, and it's something that we definitely recommend highly for all of your core sites. Matt, would you add anything to that?
No, I think that's exactly right. The only thing that I would add or echo is, as I mentioned earlier, we spent, years working with registries. We continue to spend time, energy, and effort to make that the sort of standard in the industry. Again, it's not foolproof, it's not a fail-safe, but it certainly is a much more significant level of security to protect critical domain names than we ever had in place before. And so, we'll continue to do that. We continue to counsel folks that it's a really important feature to have on your, again, these are your critical sort of crown jewel domains that we recommend have that high level registry lock applied to it.
Great. Let's see. The next question in the queue is, please describe the web traffic service that you provide. And so I can do that. Quickly, we provide insight into traffic kind of two different ways. Assuming that the names are registered with MarkMonitor and we are managing DNS for you, if you're utilizing our web forwarding, we can tell you, with certainty how many times a particular page has been visited, and that's something that we display within our portal. We can also, if you're not using our web forwarding and you're using just standard DNS and you're pointing pages via A records, we're able to provide you query information. And then that is also a good indicator of traffic volumes. It's not as certain as web forwarding, but it is a very robust method and we offer those services to all clients, and that gives you a very good indication of what kind of traffic you're getting to a particular site. Let's see, just going down. Here is another question about, I think this question is asking about the impact of redirecting domains. I think it's what is the impact to a company's SEO program? And again, I can take that. So in terms of ensuring every domain is resolving somewhere, certainly if there are concerns about pointing, domains back to your core site and what the, impact of that might be, it's not necessary that you, look, we're saying that, basically make sure those domains point somewhere. Leverage the traffic. If you're concerned about, potential negative implications, at a minimum, make sure the domains are pointing to a parked page. And, the reason being is if you don't point those names somewhere, depending on what kind of a search engine someone is using or who your ISP is, if a domain is registered by you and you are not pointing it somewhere, it's very possible and likely that it's going to be directed somewhere else, that particular person who is looking for your page, who may have typed in a variation of one of your domains by accident that you own as a defensive registration, they may get directed to a list of alternative sites, or they may get directed to a list of pay-per-click sites. And that's why it's so important that every domain that you have is pointing somewhere. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to point it back to content, although we do recommend that. If you're concerned about any potential implication for SEO, then at least at the minimum point it to a parked page. Now you can do that almost across the board. There are some TLDs that have a prohibition on parked pages. So you have to be aware of that. One of them that does have a prohibition on parked pages, unfortunately, is the .sucks TLD. So that is one that either you will need to direct to some actual content, or you'll need to not direct anywhere because it is not possible, according to their terms and conditions, to point it to a parked page. Let's see, moving on. So here's another question about traffic. If a client has registered domain names with other providers like GoDaddy, do we have to transfer them to MarkMonitor to track traffic, or can we just ask you to track the traffic? Matt?
I'll take that one. So we only provide DNS service for domain names that are under our management as a registrar. So our core business is not to be a DNS web forwarding provider. It's a service that we provide free to our clients for the domains that they have under MarkMonitor Management. So yes, those names would need to be transferred over to MarkMonitor, and then we would put them on our DNS infrastructure with the ability to then track those web forwarding traffic.
Great. Here's another question. As a brand owner who's registered a lot of domain names, we're looking to pare them down, usually variations of the brand, but within a variety of different TLDs. In this situation, it would be weird to sell these into the secondary market. I fully agree. You would not, just to answer this quickly, we would never recommend doing that. When we suggest selling names, we're talking about names which are not connected to you, they do not contain your brand, they might be generic, they might be acronyms, they might be things that maybe at one time you were thinking of marketing or packaging, but you never did. So yeah, we would never recommend selling on the secondary market domains that actually contain your brand. Okay, here's a question. I have heard that Donuts has sold one or more TLDs, apparently without notice to registrants, and the new owners are not honoring the DPML block. Do you have any information on this?
I don't know about you, Elisa. I don't have any information other than we have heard that amongst the ICANN circle. We actually have asked what the process would be if they do sell a TLD. Would the block carry over? What's the notification process? I'm not aware of any concrete, confirmed information that we've got. But Elisa, I don't know if you have anything additional.
I do know that there were some registries that I think Right-Side Registry took over before the TLDs were actually delegated, so they were never actually run or delegated to Donuts. And because of that, it's not, basically they weren't, people hadn't registered in that TLD and then the registry was sold. The registry was sold before it was actually granted to Donuts.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know if we have had an actual confirmed case of them actually delegating, and redelegating is actually what would happen, redelegating a delegated TLD where there were existing blocks. We have had the case where they've done it prior to being delegated and having blocks secured, but I don't know that we have an actual case. But we have asked the hypothetical question of what do those blocks carry over to the new registry operator? Is there some sort of notice period, what that process is?
Right. So we can probably take a couple more questions because we're just at about time. We'll try to do some of these quickly. Here's a question: where is domain scoring available in the portal? Is it an add-on? Is there an added cost? So it's something that we're doing for MarkMonitor clients. There is no additional cost, but it does require analysis. So it's something that we'll work with each of the clients on, and it is made visible in the portal. So once we've completed the analysis and the scoring has been completed, it's possible to see it within your portfolio, and it's something that you would select from the Configure Display button. And so if you do have a desire to go through this process, just speak with your client service manager and we'll get you in the queue. Here's a question. Are there any CCTLDs that are problematic for hijacking, thus a recommendation to have a high level of lock? Matt?
Yeah, it's a great question. What I would say, well, a couple of things. Number one, there is a list of probably 24 or so at this point, CCTLD operators that have already in the past had domains that have been hijacked, and so that's one place to start. The other thing I would say is that if you look at the world of CCTLD operators, they really run the gamut from very sophisticated, well-oiled machines that you would sort of compare to folks like VeriSign and Neustar in the GTLD world, folks like Nominate, .co.uk, .de with DNIC, .nl in the Netherlands. There's a number of those kind of more sophisticated players, but then I would say there's a number of less sophisticated players that probably the risk is somewhat higher in those places as well. But really we have sort of taken the approach of trying to get as many CCTLD operators, the big ones and the small ones, to incorporate things like Registry Lock. And so, if you are a MarkMonitor client, we're happy to sort of work with you on what our recommendations would be based on what we've seen in the past, your existing portfolio, and other factors like that.
So we're just at about time, but there's a couple of questions I'm going to answer them really fast. There's a question about, would you really want to have something like .porn or .adult pointing to your page? And I would say probably not, no. But then there's another question about how does a corporation create and implement a parked page. So MarkMonitor has a parked page that we use. So it's a page that simply says this name is registered and protected by MarkMonitor, and that's all that's on that page. And so if you want to take advantage of using that, that's something that we can help you with. A question about how the value of domain names are determined, and I assume this is maybe talking about domains that you think might have some value. We actually have an entire department that's focused on domain acquisition and sales, and we've got a couple of people that are really they're truly industry experts. They've been doing this for 10 years, and they can do a no-cost evaluation. Again, if you're a MarkMonitor client, you think that you've got something that you want to think about selling, again, work with your client service manager, and we can help you understand what the value of that might be. I think with that, we are just at about time. So I want to turn it back over to Corinne to wrap us up.
Great. Thank you, Elisa and Matt, for such an informative presentation. We really appreciate you sharing your experience. I'd also like to thank our audience for your participation. As a final reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar materials, so be on the lookout for that email. This concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a wonderful day, everyone.